It was after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 that the Soviet government stripped hundreds of thousands of Russian migrants of their citizenship in Russia. In just a single moment, they had no state to recognize them any longer, no passport to carry. 5 years later, the League of Nations would intervene by issuing a special travel document for those affected. It was called the Nansen Passport. That passport was the only document that confirmed their existence as Russians. To anyone who saw it, they were a foreigner nevertheless, by virtue of the fact that it was a passport. There was no seal of their homeland. There was no government's stamp. The document was eventually honored by 52 governments, mercifully, and they could move through the world. They could enjoy travel, but tragically, they could not go home, and they were powerless to change that. They were shut out by their homeland. It really is a modern portrait of exile, the very exile that Isaiah's audience would come to know for themselves. What was even worse in their case is that their barrier to entry into the promised land was not a closed border, but more importantly, the demand of God's justice. You see, Isaiah's audience stood condemned before God because they had broken their covenant with him. The result was national defeat, displacement, God's silence, and their apparent defeat. It did not catch God off guard, of course. God warned in Leviticus chapter 26, if you will not listen to me and will not do all of my commandments, and if you spurn my statutes, and if your soul abhors my rules, I will visit you with panic, with wasting disease and fever that consume the eyes and make the heart ache. You shall sow your seed in vain. Your enemies will eat it, and I will set my face against you, and you shall be struck down before your enemies. God had issued a very stern warning from the start. You obey me, and you will be blessed. But you disobey me, you will suffer the consequences. And Isaiah's audience would indeed come to experience precisely those consequences. And it's that context that helps us as we come to this final of the servant songs. Thank you. Got something hanging. The first of the servant songs, God presented the servant in Isaiah chapter 42. Behold, my servants, God declared. In the next two servant songs, Isaiah 49 and Isaiah 50, we heard the servant speak. The servant declared his calling, and God would affirm it. The servant declared, as we heard last week, God, Yahweh, my Father, shall be my strength. Now, this final servant song we come to, we hear from the nation. We hear from the displaced people. We hear from the wayward who cry out, having seen, with their own eyes, what the servant would do to remedy their situation, to remedy their plight. Understand, beloved, we are in the same predicament as Israel. We stand condemned before a holy God. We have been given commands to follow, to obey, and we have no power to satisfy what God's justice demands for having broken them. Very often we try to live a disciplined life. We try to live a life of sincerity. We try to be faithful church attendees. But those things by themselves simply will not close the gap. There's a very wide chasm that separates us from God. God's standard is something that we can never meet on our best day, to say nothing of our best life. Maybe you're here this afternoon and you know what it feels like to pray and to feel like you can't hear anything in response. Maybe it feels as if God is absent as you pray. Or maybe it just feels like there's something that's just standing in the way. Something that's distorting the frequency, as it were. Something that stands between us and Him. And you don't have the power to remove it. You don't have the power to tune the frequency to just the right place. Enter the servant who is commissioned to close the gap. We actually need to start at 52, verse 13. So just move back a few verses, and you will see God speaks, setting this up. Behold my servant. Familiar to us, having surveyed all of these servant songs. Behold my servant, who will act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. Spoiler alert, that's exactly what just happened. God presents His servant, and He already declares the end. He already declares what's going to happen here when it's all over. He shall be high. In the Hebrew, He will be raised up, speaking to His having been raised from the dead. He shall be lifted up, that is, He will ascend. And He will be highly exalted, that is, He will be seated at my right hand. We see the resurrection, the ascension, and His seated in glory right here in verse 13, before we even get into the song. My servant will succeed. Not even death will stop him. And when his work is complete, he will come and sit with me. And then in verse 14, as many as were astonished at you, my servant. Notice his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. You will succeed in your mission, my servant, but notice how you will succeed. You will be subjected to violence, to so extreme that those who see you can no longer make out a human face. We have the luxury of hindsight. We know exactly what this text speaks to. We've commemorated it just a short while ago. But it is through that, verse 15, that you, my servant, shall sprinkle many nations. There, the sprinkling, the idea is of a priest going into the temple, taking the blood of a bull and sprinkling it on the altar. You, my servants, are the sacrifice whose blood will cleanse the nations. And as a result, it says, kings shall shut their mouths because of him. That is to say, they will look in awe. They will look in wonder. They will look with a sense of reverence for that which has not been told them, they see, and that which they have not heard, they understand. Think how you feel when someone walks into a room carrying wounds, arms in a cast, people in a wheelchair, missing limbs, missing hair, large scars. When we see that, there's a sort of reverence that overcomes us. There's a sort of calm silence that we feel we need to have. It's that same sort of feeling that it says, all of the kings of the earth, when they behold this servant, when they behold Jesus Christ, they will have nothing to say. They can do nothing but stand in silence. Now, I believe this is looking forward to his second coming, this verse. What a glorious day that will be when he appears. All of the nations of the earth, all of God's enemies, all of the kings will stand with their mouths shut. In this final servant song, in the remainder of these verses, we're going to hear from the people of God, the people who look on the servants. They are going to declare, they're going to confess with great wonder all that the servant accomplishes. It's as if this is the audience who beholds Christ at his second coming. And they look back and they recount everything that he accomplished up to that point. They're going to confess the glories of this servant. The question for us is whether this confession reflects the cry of our hearts this afternoon. Do these things resonate with us? Can we identify with the chastised nation here who beholds the servant for what he has accomplished for them? It is my prayer that you can. The first one we see in verse 1. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? We received the reports. The message was declared over and over again. It was concerning the Lord's arm. How strong is somebody? Usually you can get a good sense by looking at the size of their biceps, right? It signifies how strong they are. Who is the arm of the Lord? It is none other than this servant. His power to save. Who has believed the word that has gone forth? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. We treated him like I dug a little bit into the translation in ESV as young plant. The idea is a branch that sucks. It's like a rogue branch that's sucking all the nutrients so that the tree cannot produce fruit elsewhere. And those who would prune these trees, they would know to trim these branches so that they stop sucking all the nutrients. A sort of imposter branch that's hogging it all. That's how it says they treated him. This servant, he was simply to be cut down and thrown into the fire. He was like a root out of dry ground. That is to say, he was worthless to grow anything, simply to be stepped on. Dry ground is not going to produce growth. We treated him as that. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. Not that he was ugly, but simply that attractiveness is not what characterized him. He did not necessarily have the charisma, the attractive quality that usually accompanies somebody who is famous, someone who's a king, a beloved king at that. No, he was despised and rejected by men. That is, he was rejected by Ishim in the Hebrew, lords, men of rank. He was rejected by any and all leaders and societal influencers. He was considered to be a misfit, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. The Hebrew words there are interesting. Not sorrows, but pains. And not grief, but sicknesses. He was acquainted with pains and with sicknesses. And we know this to be true in his earthly ministry. They brought to him all who were sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. He was acquainted with the lowly. He was acquainted with those who were sick, those who were ailed, those who suffered great pain and sorrow. He was among them. And he was repulsed as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. It is their confession, beloved. They look at their lives, they look at their former reception of the servants, and they are driven to great shame, great sorrow. Oh, what have we done? We esteemed him not. We despised him. We discarded him like trash. All to our shame. Famous story from a few years ago. The world's most exquisite instrument is the 1713 Stradivarius violin. Apparently it's worth $3.5 million. It's the sort of violin that even the best violinists, all they can ever do is rent it. They can never own it. There was a world-renowned violinist who just happened to get a hold of this violin. And he set himself up in a Washington, D.C. metro station in order to play as a street performer during morning rush hour. To complete the ensemble, he wore jeans and a baseball cap, but he had that Stradivarius. And of course, he was a world-renowned violinist, and so he could really make it sing. For just 45 minutes, you had thousands of commuters that just passed right on by on their way to work, not even bother to stop, not even bother to glance at what he was doing. Interestingly enough, children were the most eager to pause and listen, but their parents would just pull them away. We got somewhere to be. Just 2 days before this event, that performer had sold out a concert hall in Boston for $100 a seat. The problem was not the music. The problem was that the people had decided this individual was not worth their time. And likewise here, the problem was not the servants. It was we who saw him in our carnal state, pursuing our lives, our interests, not at all concerned about who he was. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him. We walked right on by we esteemed him not. This is our shame, beloved. Made all the more apparent as we continue, because not only is it our shame, he is our sin. Yes, he is our sin. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Beloved, don't overlook those words. Griefs and sorrows. Pains and sicknesses. You come here today with pain in your heart, in your life, physically. You come here today carrying a sickness. Take hold of the promise here. He bore those pains and sicknesses. He took them on his back. I help you, you hurt me, was the relationship. Surely he has accomplished this, and yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted, rather than say thanks. Rather than appreciate what he bore on himself, instead we say he got what he had coming to him. But here's the key. He was pierced for our transgressions and was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. He is our sin. He became sin on our behalf. He bore the due penalty for our wrongdoing. He was the substitute. He received what we had coming to us. And it is in his pain, in his sorrow, in his grieving, his sickness, that we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. How sweet it is to be here as the people of God, to be able to declare this collectively. Yahweh has laid on our Lord Jesus Christ the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, and yet he opened not his mouth. He did not seek recompense. He sought only to finish the task the Lord had for him. He was like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, he opened not his mouth. I was interested to learn this week about an old ritual in Wales, in the English countryside, called sin eating. This took place in maybe the early Middle Ages. If someone died suddenly, before they had a chance to confess their sins, the family of that individual would call on a particular kind of man in the community. And the man that they would call on usually was somebody who was considered poor, an outcast, a reject. Bread and ale was literally placed on the chest of this deceased individual. And the sin eater, the individual that they would designate, the sin eater, would come for a meal. And they would eat that meal using the corpse as his table. It was believed that he would absorb the dead person's sins into himself by engaging in this and clearing the way for the soul of that deceased individual to rest in peace. After the meal, this individual was just sent away. The family would burn the wooden plate he had eaten from. They would avoid him in public, pretended as if he never existed. He was considered contaminated, unclean, fit only to be summoned, used, and discarded. The families with this ritual needed the sin borne, and they had contempt for the one who bore it. Verse 9, in the contempt against the servants, they made his grave with the wicked. He died alongside thieves. Give us Barabbas was the cry. They considered him as good as dead, his life of no more value than those otherwise designated for capital punishment. And then it says, with a rich man in his death. We believe that speaks to his burial, receiving the honorable burial. Although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth, as Paul said, he was buried according to the Scriptures. You ever wonder, buried according to the Scriptures? Here it is right here. He was buried just as the Scriptures declared. Now, if this were a tragedy, this would be where the curtain falls. Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet. A man who did nothing wrong, considered to be a thief, considered to be a lawless individual, discarded, killed, laid in the ground. But how did this text open? Verse 13. We already know how the story ends. I told you there was a spoiler alert. God spoiled the story. It's not the end. The curtain doesn't fall, at least not to end the story. It's just the end of Act 2. What looks like tragedy was never tragedy at all. His vindication on the horizon. And his vindication is our hope. Verse 10. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. Understand, in the Hebrew, it was his delight to crush him. What a mystery. It was the will of Yahweh that the servant would be crushed. Why? Because for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that if we would believe in him, we would not perish, but have everlasting life. It was his delight to crush the servant in order that we might be saved. He has put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for guilt. Notice, he shall see his offspring, those who would come after him. He shall see them. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. A skeptic might look at this and say, we have a contradiction here. He just died. He was just buried. How can he see his offspring? How can his days be prolonged any further? He died. We see in this the declaration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The servant conquers death. He is raised triumphant. And out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. There it is. Why is it his delight to crush the servant? Because it is out of that crushing that many are accounted righteous. Yes, beloved, you this afternoon, as you have placed your faith in the Lord Jesus, you are made righteous. It was the Father's will to crush the servant for you. And recall the previous servant song. It was the servant's delight to do the Father's bidding. For you, in love. And as a result, verse 12, God declares, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressions. Yes, he will be vindicated. And the idea of being divided a portion, divided the spoil, that's indicating there's a kingdom that awaits for him. He will establish himself as king on this earth. And we, beloved, as those who follow him, will rule and reign with him, we are told. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. For roughly 1,000 years, Isaiah 53 has been omitted from weekly readings in the synagogues, Jewish synagogues. They skip right over it. A 17th century Jewish historian said that the chapter caused so many arguments and great confusion for the Jewish community that the rabbis just quietly removed it. Literally, they'll read Isaiah 52, and then they'll jump to Isaiah 54. Yet it still remains in every Hebrew Bible. Ask a Jewish individual to give you their Hebrew text. You can open right up to Isaiah 53. You might know the name, recognize the name Zvi Kalisher. He was a Holocaust survivor who came to faith in Jerusalem. He would pen Apples of Gold. That was a column that you might have seen in Israel, My Glory. It was a column that was written for 55 years going. Mr. Kalisher was an evangelist, one who carried the gospel to his Jewish brethren. He spent many decades ministering in ultra-Orthodox synagogues. He entered into one, they're called a yeshiva, which is basically like a seminary or a college, something like that. He walked into a yeshiva, he recalls, and he opened up the Bible, this Hebrew Bible, to Isaiah 53, and he handed it to someone that he had never met before. And he asked the simple question, what is this chapter, who is this chapter speaking about? The man read the text in Hebrew, maybe even read it aloud. And then he set the Bible down and he answered the question. Who is Isaiah 53 reading about? This individual said, without you telling us, we now know in whom you have believed. Saved right there on the spot. No New Testament, no Christian explanation, no theological debate. Just the text of Isaiah 53 that we have read this afternoon. Likely for that individual, read for the very first time. So often skipped over. And that story is just one from countless others of Jewish individuals who have come to faith through this text. The servant is vindicated. He has been raised, and to this day, his offspring keeps appearing. Praise God. And he keeps the will, and the will of the Lord keeps prospering in his hand. And so as we conclude, we must reflect. Do you hear yourself in that phrase? The phrase that I was delighted to speak, the iniquity of us all. Can you identify there? Yes, the servant has bore my sin in himself. Do you count yourself among the transgressors? He was crushed and he was buried. And then he rose, prolonged his days. He looks out at his offspring and he is satisfied. That chasm between us and God is closed. Not by anything we have done, but by the will of the Lord prospering in the servant's hand.